Hello and welcome to Master Gardening. I'm your host Bud Qualk, and today we've got a wide range of topics to cover. Everything but the kitchen sink. Hello, Bud's Tomato Patch. Tomatoes are probably the #1 vegetable that people grow in their home gardens. And today we're going to learn almost everything there is to know about tomatoes. I'm going to plant one today, and this is usually what happens. The first thing you do is plant them. This is one that I grew in my greenhouse. It's called it's an heirloom. It's a beefsteak master, that's what it's called. Okay, when you plant a tomato, and we've had this in the other shows, it's good to go ahead and plant it as deep as you can because the tomato plant is very unusual. The stem will grow new roots. So whatever part of the stem you put down in the ground, it's going to grow more roots. So especially if you've got a real tall plant, stick about 3/4 of it in the ground because you're not going to grow any tomatoes on the bottom of that thing. It's going to make good roots. You can pull the dirt around the plant, and if you're wanting to water, leave a little bowl around it. Of course, all plants leave a bowl around it. On this bed, all we're going to use this year is a little bit of mulch. When I first started growing tomatoes, I didn't even mulch. I just weeded a lot. And then I realized if you mulch, you weed less. So I've tried different kinds of mulch, and over the years, this has been the cheapest and the easiest for me to find out. I have a bagger on my lawnmower, and I collect my mulch in the fall. I put it on my beds along with some compost in the fall. That way there's no weeds in the spring, just like this bed right here, very easy. No weeds, it's easy to get started. And then I use the same leaves for the mulch around the tomato plant. Okay, that tomato plant is ready to go. It's gonna start growing. I might put a little water on it. The ground was really wet to begin with, so it doesn't need a whole lot. And they're predicting rain tonight, so perfect. I like to plant them right before a couple days of overcast because that sun is rough on any plant. If you can figure out a way to plant in the middle of a rain, that's the best, or right before a rain or an overcast day. I'm not going to water that. Some people would. Okay, this bed over here, I'm trying a new technique. I'm using this. It's not plastic. I hate plastic. It takes thousands of years to break down. That's cotton. The cotton cloth and the rain and the fertilizer I put on it and everything else goes right through that. Doesn't restrict it. But it does restrict two things. It restricts the weeds coming through there, just like the leaves, any other mulch. And it also, hopefully, will hold down the diseases. If you're from Western Kentucky, you know all about diseases. You got them on all your fruit trees. You've got them on your roses, a black spot. You've got them on your grapes, called black rot. On tomatoes, it's the same funguses, but it's called wilts and blights and things like that, but it's the same thing. It's a bunch of funguses. We live within 30 miles of 60% of all the water in the whole United States here in Western Kentucky. I know you don't believe that, but I promise you I've looked that up. It's true. So we have lots of funguses. It's very humid in the summertime, which you already know. And tomato plants are not supposed to die in the middle of summer like some people think. Oh, my tomato plants are done. It's July and August. That's the wilts killing them. They ought to live nice and green and produce tomatoes right up to the last frost. But in Western Kentucky, that's a job. 2 of the ways you can do it, or 3 or 4 of the ways you can do it, you can buy resistant plants. Those are hybrids. What I planted over here was the heirloom. That's an old plant that is not resistant to the wilts. It's got more chance of dying early. These hybrids over here are going to last longer because they've been propagated and designed to be resistant to the wilts and the fungus. That's one thing, get hybrids. You can't gather those seeds in the fall though because they won't come up true. The heirlooms, once you buy those, you can continue to gather the seeds and they'll be true. And that's what I've done. I gather the seeds and have the same heirlooms over and over and over again. The hybrids won't come true. The other thing you can do is spray. This is a fungicide. You can get organic fungicides. The stronger the fungicide, the better, I think. If you want to grow tomatoes, if you don't want to grow tomatoes and be organic, that's okay. But if you want to grow tomatoes all year long, you probably need to go ahead and use some chemicals. The commercial growers around here spray this on their tomatoes once a week. You say, oh my gosh. Well, that's what the fruit growers do also. In the orchards, they spray their orchards about once a week. Spray them about once a week. Don't wait till you see the wilt. Once you see the wilt, they're goners. You can't stop it. So what do? Is you prevent it from starting in the first place. Well, where does this fungus come from? You know, is it carried in on the ship from China? No, it's in our soil. There's fungus right in this soil right here. How does it get on the plant? You know, you got the plant there and you got the leaves are up about some maybe 5, 6, 7 inches off the ground. Well, when you water it, you don't want to water those plants and splash that water up on the plants because you're helping the fungus splash up on the plants. When it rains real hard, it splashes that fungus up on the bottom leaves. So when you see the wilts and those type things, they start on the bottom leaves and then they splash from the bottom leaves to the next set, the next set, the next set. And if you're a tomato grower, you know what I'm talking about. The leaves on the bottom start turning yellow and pretty soon the whole plant's yellow. So if you use a mulch, or hopefully what I'm using this year, this cotton, it's going to keep that from splashing up on the plants, and hopefully it'll retard the wilts and the fungus on these plants right here. We're going to see. This is a controlled group. Okay, I talked about heirlooms and hybrids. Hybrids have been bred mainly because of the wilts and the diseases, but they've also been bred to be a bigger tomato, to get more tomatoes, to maybe get the right size tomato, maybe like a cherry tomato. I used to be a test gardener. Some tomatoes are sweeter than others. Some have tough skins. Some are bigger than others. Some of them have that good tomatoey taste. Some don't. So these breeders breed them where they have the better tomato taste, the sweeter, and the thinner skins. Nobody likes any of that. And then the size, of course, and color. What are these things right here? Let's talk about that for a second. This is pretty early in the spring. Most people don't have their tomato plants in yet. These are rebar. This is rebar. I got this a few years ago. I went down and bought a bunch of 8-foot rebar. It's perfect. 8 foot. It was straight when I bought it. If you stick it in one side of your bed, a 4-foot bed, and that's my standard bed, and most people think about 4-foot beds because that's how far you can reach in, 2 feet from each side. Stick it in the ground and then bend it over like this. Makes a little hoop, and you probably know what's going to happen next. If it gets cold at night, I can put a blanket over top of this, protect it. If it gets too cold, I can put plastic over top of it. If I don't want to get it rained on, I can put plastic over top of it. And you can buy plastic in the stores that are 8 feet wide by whatever length, 100 feet if you want. 8 feet is exactly what you need to go from over there to over here, remember? And maybe even 12 feet would be even better. This 8-foot rebar, okay? So that's how, it only looks 4 foot wide, but it needs at least 8 to 12 feet in width in the plastic. Okay, what's next? When this plant gets so big, guess what's going to happen to it? It's going to fall over. Tomato plants aren't sturdy enough to grow 4, 5, 6, 7 feet tall without some support. My dad always used stakes. He had a wooden stake he'd drive in the ground. He'd tear a sheet up and have these little slips of sheet that was real soft. He'd take it around the plant and tie it. Gosh, that was a lot of work. We had like 100 tomato plants. Take all day to do that. Okay, so nowadays you can use cages. Well, I didn't mention you can just let it lay on the mulch too. I've never liked that. You never get a whole lot of tomatoes, and there's a lot more chance of your plant dying early from the fungus because your plant's laying right on the ground. Cages. This cage here I made in 1976, I think. It's not even rusted. It's made out of the type of material that the farmers use on their fences, and when I die, my son can use this the rest of his life. One thing wrong with this, it's too short. My tomato plants are going to be up here like this. They're going to be 6, 7 feet tall. This would be good for what they call a determinate tomato. A lot of you all know what I'm talking about, but there's a few of you out there may not. A determinate plant is a lot shorter. The size is determinate. It's only going to grow like 4 foot tall, and then it's going to quit. That's as tall as it's going to get. And the other thing about determinate is it's going to grow all of its tomatoes, bam, all at once. So if you're a commercial grower and you don't want to pick a field every day for 3 months, you want to pick a field once or twice and be done with it, determinate plants produce all their tomatoes basically at the same time. So you pick the field just a couple times. I got tired of this one because my plant would grow out the top and fall over here and it'd be a mess. So I went to the farm store and got a bigger cage, or taller fence really. This is really fence material. And my tomatoes still grow out the top of this, but not very much. This is much better than that other one. It's a little bit stiffer too. The way I made it was I bought the fence. I figured out how many of these squares it would take to make it this approximately this size. And if you'll notice, you can put 2 of these side by side in a 4-foot bed. This takes about 2 feet here. And also in an 8-foot bed, you can get 4 of them, 2 feet wide, bam, bam, bam. So your diameter here is about 2 feet. Count these little squares. And so I rolled that fence out and I'd count the squares and cut, count the squares and cut, count the squares and cut. And then I would cut it so that there would be a little bit of a tag right here, and then I'd roll it up into a circle, put that piece around there all the way down through here. I did that. And some people in the winter take these apart and put them in the attic. Gosh, that's a lot of trouble. But that's my tomato cages. Lay them on the ground, stake them, cages. I've even seen where, and I've got a fence over here we might look at later, but there's a fence you can put in there and you can tie them to that fence. I like that better than the stakes because it's about as little work as this. The tomato's going to get this big around. I go in there every once in a while and kind of fluff it and make these stems go back inside. If they go out here too far, they get in the way, I'll curl them back in and stick them back up in here. And they're easy to pick. You see the size of these squares. I've seen fences that the people have used where you couldn't get your hand in here. That's not good. Okay. Any questions? No. Thanks, John. Well, I'll tell you what, let's go over and look at some daffodils. I want to show you how my daffodils are doing this year, a couple tricks you might want to try. Okay? We'll be right back. Daffodils. It's that time of year. Everybody's got daffodils. If you want to know where the houses were back in the old days, you go out some old country road and look for daffodils that are in the ditch or in an open field or around a clump of trees, and there's no house there. It's because daffodils, once you plant them, they'll probably be there forever. You have to have really something crazy go wrong with daffodils to kill them. Very strong. So that's where the old houses were, where the daffodils are back in the field. These daffodils are almost done. But John, you notice I've got a bunch of different places where they're still pretty. I enjoy them for months and months. How do you do that? Don't they all pretty well come up and die at the same time? No, every variety has a different time that starts blooming and quits blooming. So if you, and I've probably got 40 different varieties here, but if you plant a bunch of different varieties, not all the same one, you'll have different daffodils blooming at different times. You can also, and people don't know this, when you buy the daffodil bulbs in the fall, everybody puts them in the ground in October, September. You can hold on to those babies till March, sometimes April before you plant them. If they'll live that long, sometimes the bulb will deteriorate. But if it doesn't, you can plant daffodil bulbs in March and April, and they'll bloom a lot later than the rest of them. Obviously, it takes longer. But what do you do with these daffodils when they start looking bad? And they can look bad. I've got on the other side of the driveway, I've got a bunch of them, 2 different varieties, and by the time they get done ripening, they're going to be really ugly. Okay, first thing, and if you don't have a whole lot of daffodils, people like to go around and snip them off with the scissors. Okay, so they don't look quite so bad. And then the foliage doesn't look quite so bad. You don't need scissors. You can pop these seed heads off with your hand. Now there's an advantage to doing that also, and you mentioned it a while ago, that the strength of that plant will go into the bulb, making a new bulb instead of into making seeds. If you pull that seed pod off, the plant realizes there's no reason to put any more of its strength into that because the seed pods are gone. So you pull the seed pods off and your bulbs will get bigger. Now if you've got as many daffodils as I do, you don't want to spend all your time pulling the seed pods off. So if you don't, you're still going to be all right. It just looks prettier and it makes for a bigger bulb. Okay, once all these things are gone, all you've got is foliage, green foliage. A lot of people mow that down. It's not a smart thing to do. In one of our other shows, I showed where the daffodil and some other bulbs, everything that daffodil needs is in that bulb. It doesn't need any soil, it needs some water. The bloom is in that bulb, the leaves are in that bulb, everything's in that bulb to make the plant for this year. The problem is the plant for next year. If you don't give it some soil and nutrients and let it get the green foliage, it won't produce a bulb for next year's growth. So all this foliage is about next year. You want to let it go ahead and turn yellow, let it on its own turn yellow, don't cut it down. Once it turns yellow, then you can cut it off, it's done. It's ready for next year. Martha Stewart came up with this idea that made everybody mad. She introduced tying your daffodil foliage up, because it doesn't look too bad right now, but as it's going to start laying down on the ground. It's going to look like heck. And if it's in the front yard like mine, curb appeal, people walking by and whatever are going to be disturbed because Bud doesn't keep a clean yard. And I stay awake late at night worrying about that, of course. But what she does, she takes the clumps and then she ties them together, similar to that. And she thinks that looks better than a bunch of these laying down on the ground. And I don't see anything wrong with that. But daffodil lovers say by putting that string or cloth around there, you're restricting the water flow in this foliage. Therefore, you're going to restrict the growth of the bulb, and you're going to have smaller bulbs next year. Yes, I think that's right if you go ahead and just pull it real tight and snap that foliage. But if you just put a little string around there or something, I think it'd be okay. Tulips don't do well in Western Kentucky for a number of reasons. One, they are really accustomed to a colder climate. They go ahead and bloom great the first year, but then they've got to go through the torture of making a new bulb for the next year. They're used to going to freezing before they have to come back out and produce again. So if you know somebody, say in the south or in our zone, which, Brad, you know what zone we're in? No, that's the time zone. No, it's 7. We were in 6. That's farther north. And all of Kentucky is zone 6. That tells you how the temperature is. It never gets down below 10 degrees in the wintertime. 7 is what Tennessee and Alabama and Virginia and those places are, 7. Western Kentucky is the only place in Kentucky that is really a zone 7. That's too hot for tulips. But there's a couple ways you can trick them. After they've bloomed, after the foliage has died down, dig them, and then right before you plant them the next year, maybe 2 months before you plant them the next spring, put them in the refrigerator for a couple months. Make them think they're in a really cold climate. Don't put them in the freezer, that's not a good idea. But put them in the refrigerator, give them that cold. And then plant them again in the spring, like in maybe February, March, plant them again. There's a guy in California I saw on TV the other day, his whole yard is nothing but tulips. He's the only one in the whole city that grows tulips because of the climate. He digs every one of those things up every year and replants them. He's got to be crazy. But that's the way you can do tulips. Asparagus is next. Let's go to Bud's asparagus patch. It's that time of year. Asparagus, oh asparagus, wherefore art thou asparagus? Asparagus, as opposed to most of the things in the garden, is a perennial. That's good. You don't have to plant it every year. You plant it 1 year and you got it the rest of your life, if you take care of it. I was in the doctor's office the other day and the nurse said, have I planted my asparagus this year? And I said, well, I planted my asparagus in 1992. And she said, what? So I had to explain to her, it's a perennial. And you can't eat your perennial asparagus the first year. When you plant it the first year, it's just to get it started. You want it to get it strong, build up the strength, and you don't eat anything. You don't want to even touch it the first year. The second year it comes up, taste it. That's it. Just try a couple of them, see how it's going to be in a few years, and let it build up again, get stronger and stronger. By the third year, it ought to be strong enough that you can go ahead and eat all you want. Now, I found out something the other day that was very unusual, and you learn something every day sometimes. Asparagus, when it comes up like this, you can see these stalks, they're beautiful, but asparagus wants to be cut once a year. It doesn't have to be in the spring. Okay, that's kind of strange, right? Most people eat it when it comes up like this, and you can cut it for about a month, month and a half, and then you need to quit cutting it and let it grow the big, tall, shrubby bushes that we'll show in a different show, and let it rebuild the roots strength for the next year. What I found out was you don't have to cut it in the spring. Go ahead and let this get tall, and I don't have the guts to do it. Let it get tall, and then in the fall, if you want to, cut it down, and it'll come back up like this. You can cut it, eat it for a month, and let it get tall again. So you can eat asparagus any time of the year. It takes a lot of guts not to eat it when it comes up the first time. You'll notice I've got a lot of compost on here. This is compost out of my compost bin, which we'll talk about some other program. Asparagus is a heavy feeder, and I even found out the hard way. If you don't fertilize the heck out of it, and every year put more and more compost on it, it's going to get weaker and weaker. The plants get weaker, and when it gets weaker, it sends up smaller, thinner shoots and less. So if you want a strong bed, feed the heck out of it all year long, even in the winters. Feed it. One other thing about asparagus you want to know is that the roots slowly but surely will find the surface. They'll work their way up. You may start them out a foot deep or 6 inches deep, and they'll slowly work their way up to the surface. So that's another good reason to continue to put compost on top, so that as it's working its way up to the top, you're putting more soil or compost on top. And like I told Brad and John, everything you see in this garden here is not a whole lot here. It's my first crop of the year. This will be solid shoots here in another week or two, but every one of these things will be in my belly tonight. Okay, let's go look at some flowering shrubs. When do you prune shrubs? I get that question all the time. And it's a little bit tricky. If you don't know what you're doing, you can really screw up the blooms. But there's one rule you can go by that works almost 1000%. Wait till it gets done blooming. And get this is very important. Things that bloom in the spring are blooming on old wood. In the fall, if it blooms in the fall, that means it's blooming on new wood that grew all summer long, and then it finally blooms in the fall. Lots of things bloom in the spring. Azaleas, forsythias, just on and on and on. So once they get done blooming and you've enjoyed the bloom, cut them down. Now, before I go any further, isn't that pretty red? That's not red just because people like red. You can see these, and if I threw it over there in the bushes, you could see it. You can find it. If your spouse is like mine, they never put the tools back on the rack. They're probably somewhere laying out there where they worked last. So if you don't have bright colored handles on your shovels and hoes, and especially the smaller tools, make sure you do that. Yeah, how do you prune this bush? Well, first of all, this is a little bit unusual. It's a little bit invasive. These plants down here have come from rhizomes from the main plant, and it's taken a couple years for them to get out here. I'm going to dig those up and throw them in the trash, and I'm going to save a few of them for my enemies, because then they'll have to do the same thing I'm doing. Okay, but some of these little ones I'm going to leave, and they'll be in good shape for next year. Most shrubs, like forsythia and the japonicas, you want to cut them all the way back. And what I mean is take some loppers, trusted loppers, and don't just prune off the tops. Or I've even seen them take forsythia and box them like a hedge. Man, that's ugly. Okay, you want to make them look like nature did it. Cut it all the way back to the root. That way you don't even know I did that, unless somebody told you. Okay, forsythia, they do something similar to this. It's called, this is how they propagate themselves. Forsythia won't come up from runners, but for instance, their limbs will droop down to the ground, and they'll take root right on the ground. And then another plant will come up over here, and all you got to do in order to get that plant is cut it loose from the mother plant. I'm going to do that also today. I've got a person at the bank where I work that wants some forsythia plants, and I've got a bunch of them. And like I said, I'm going to throw a lot of them in the trash pit, but some of them I'll give to my friends. Now, if you don't prune them all the way back to the ground, and there are some plants like that, maybe some azaleas that you just want to shape up. You don't want to cut it all the way back. You just want to shape up that azalea. So what you what you do is you take it and you just shape it where you want to, and you cut just above a limb. Usually on the outside. Pick an outside limb and cut it just above that outside limb. My azaleas have got really too big, and I don't want to cut it all the way back to the ground, because then guess what? I don't have any azalea plant. So you want to just shape it like I did right there. And then the azalea will grow new growth. In the fall, that will become dormant, and next spring it'll bloom on that new growth after you've pruned it. So remember the rule, prune right after it blooms. If it blooms in the spring, it blooms on old wood. If it blooms in the fall, it blooms on new wood. Okay, it's break time. Brad, I'm gonna take a break. Mulch, to mulch or not to mulch, that's the question. But before we get started, and that's beautiful, this is a red bud tree, and it's kind of an unusual shape because of the ice storm, but probably next year I'm going to prune it to shape it. I just took the damage off like you're supposed to. I didn't top it, I didn't give it a haircut, and it kind of looks rough, but it'll be better for what I'm doing. If you haven't noticed, I'm a little eclectic in my planting. There's about 30 or 40 different kinds of plants in this little tiny spot here. You got your creeping phlox, tulips. These are little mums that'll be coming up. Poppies, and that's a beautiful one. This is the remnants of one of these. This is spirea, miniature rose. There's a canna lily down in there. You've got bunches of different kinds. These are Siberian irises. There's some regular irises over here. Crepe myrtle, flowering almond, peony, lilies, columbine, some more roses over there, daisies, lilies, just on and on and on. I like to be eclectic. I like mass like these here, but I also like a lot of different things. I like so many different plants, and if I didn't do that, I wouldn't be able to show off all the different plants. And guess what? Some of them are blooming now, some of them will bloom in another month, some of them bloom in another month. You've got blooms all year long, right into fall. Now, this is on the curb. I've got some other beds that I may or may not mulch, but I need to make my house look nice. So I'm mulching. You can see there's leftover mulch from the last time I mulched, and if you were here a little earlier, I had to rake out a bunch of leaves and stuff that were in there, and I pruned everything up so it was ready. You can get this kind of mulch right here. This is supposedly brown, but it's not. This is dyed black. You can get dyed red or any color you want, or you can just get the normal brown stuff, okay? Whatever you like. How deep do you do it? Well, this stuff is turned into gold. It used to be cheap, but it's not anymore. It's very expensive. So unless you have to keep the weeds down, a very thin layer of mulch is all you need just for show. You're just doing it for show. Okay, if you do it and you get a bunch of weeds, you need to get it thicker next year, make it thicker the next year. On roses, make it a little thicker because you want to keep down the funguses from splashing up on the plant. Well, I'm going to get busy here and finish this up. Thanks for coming to Master Gardening again. We'll see you next time. My name is Bud Qualk. Good gardening.